Clear my throat. It's been a minute. Coming at you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another fantastic episode of CafeBTW, a morning gaming podcast. I'm your host, Andy. And of course, it's a good 8 a.m. in the morning here on the West Coast, and I'm sure it's 11 a.m. on the East Coast. And I'm your Saturday morning retro gaming podcast here on Twitch. And if you're watching on a VOD, I also thank you. And if you're here live, well, we have a special treat for you because today we don't have a guest. I know it's Gannon down there, but today it's going to be a fun episode. We've talked about it in the past before, but I wanted to hone it in. And I wanted to focus in on the 90s arcade culture, which we'll go into, which was very much a part of my childhood and how I grew up and, you know, a part of my gaming life and culture as a kid that grew up as a kid in the 80s and went to high school and junior high in the 90s, especially the early 90s, where the arcade kind of came into its own in a different era, because obviously the arcade culture started in like the late 70s. It was pretty popular in the 80s, and then in the 90s it had kind of a renaissance again with different types of arcade machines like Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat and stuff like that popped up that really brought back the arcade culture in the 90s to a large extent, even though console gaming was becoming popular. But before we get into that, I got some dirty laundry, I like to say. I gotta clean up a little bit. If you're not familiar with my Twitter, we started this really cool retro gaming community. And it's really just a fantastic group of people that could come together and continue that conversation that you might have on Twitter about retro gaming, but bring it to a close-knit, fun community where you could feel safe and share all kinds of things retro gaming related, whether it's new pickups you got or just want to ask a question to a bunch of retro games of stuff you're looking for. You know, it's really a safe space. And if you'd like to join, I'll throw it in chat, and you could also check it out on my link tree. But we'd love to have you. It's still rolling out on a bunch of other platforms. But that being said, I think if you are into building a community around retro gaming and a bunch of awesome people, we already have a ton of people in there, so it's been really, really cool. And we're closing in on 1,000 members, and once we hit 1,000, we're going to be doing a giveaway, teaming up with J&L or J&N, their video game store in New York City that is going to be issuing and donating a game for the giveaway. For the retro gaming community, but I digress. Just wanted to bring it up, and if you happen to be around for it, just let me know. Now, obviously, a big topic that I didn't get to talk about is the return of Sonic in the movies. Before we get into arcade culture and stuff like that, I did want to mention that I did see Sonic 2, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it, a non-spoiler a review, because obviously I'm sure there's still people that haven't seen it. Not that, you know, there's so much that can be spoiled per se in a movie like this, but I really must say that I thoroughly was entertained by this movie. It's kind of like everything you want from a video game adaptation, you know, a movie that doesn't take itself too seriously and has fun doing it. You know, I think the problem with a lot of these video game adaptations is that a lot of them are so worried about pleasing the fan and worried about, you know, making everyone so happy, and they forget about having fun making the movie. And, you know, Jim Carrey in every freaking scene he's in is just good. There's just no way to describe how good each scene is. Once he's on the screen, it's great. It was a little bit less human-y this episode, this time around, meaning like there wasn't so much human interaction. I feel like the human storyline was like at a wedding, and it was kind of like sort of like flying as like comic relief in a lot of ways, where it didn't really necessarily need to be completely a part of the story. It was kind of like giving us more of the CGI characters than it was giving us the humans, but still a good mix of the two. And someone made a good point. Is it really still an adaptation if Sonic is not really live action. It's kind of the Roger Rabbit effect. But I feel like why would you want to even bother trying to create like a live action puppet of Sonic when I think the right way to go was to do the CGI? But I must say the movie was really good. I actually think it's better than the first one in a lot of ways. It's just a little bit more entertaining. It's a little bit more comfortable. It just seems like everything is rolling on its cylinders. It just seems to be a great movie. So, and I don't go to the movies as much anymore. So this is one of those movies that was worth going to the theaters for. And if you haven't had a chance to see Sonic, I highly recommend it. If you're a video game fan and you just want something fun to watch, go to the movies with your family, get out for once, enjoy a movie again, and, go see Sonic because it was really good. And apparently it's the largest box office hit that Jim Carrey has had in his career, which is a lot to say considering that Jim Carrey did movies like Ace Ventura and, like all these amazing movies like The Mask. And I think, let's see how much it made in the box office. Sonic 2 box office. So it looks like Sonic 2 has passed Batman with 360 million as Sonic tops 80 million last week in its second week. Wow. Well, I mean, the one advantage Sonic has is that it's not like a rated R, PG-13. What's up, Biff? Morning there, my Canadian brethren. Well, Cable Guy too, yeah, but it's crazy that this movie later in his life is his biggest box office hit. But I think a lot of it has to do with hey Tao of Power. Good to see you as well. I think it's just like Sonic 2 is sort of a family movie, and family movies really make a lot of money. Kids movies do really well because it's a broader audience that can go see them. But it's really nice to see, especially with a movie like Sonic, able to do really well in the box office and also, get away unscathed and be able to do a movie that's fun and, not too much like silly controversy behind it. There's nothing to complain about. Besides the human storyline that there was like this wedding, I mean, I could do without that. But other than that, it was pretty fun. And if you happen to, want to see a movie, there's just no way to tell you that going to see Sonic wouldn't be a good thing for you to do. So wanted to mention that I just really enjoyed it. And, that being said, get out there and check it out. Today, let's get into the topic at hand. So the topic at hand today is, and this is going to be a very casual, shoot from the hip type of episode where we're just going to walk down memories. We've done this before, but I just love the culture of the arcade. Wedding, spoiler alert. The wedding is like completely part of the storyline though in the beginning of the movie. And hey, Genzo, good to see you. So I'm not spoiling anything, but that's funny. Okay. I was born in the early 80s. I grew up as a kid in the 80s, got to experience, all the great things from the 80s, like whether it's Thundercats, He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers, cartoons, the way food was, all the snacks that we grew up with. Like the 80s was great, and the 80s had an arcade culture, but it wasn't until I got older that going to the arcade became more of, I think, a real cultural experience, because I guess I was older and I was going into junior high, and there were things that would happen on the weekend. Like, for instance, my mom would go shopping on a Saturday usually, and I would be with her, and there was a bunch of arcades in North New Jersey and even in New York State that we would go to. And I know, Genzo, we've talked about it, and you're from New Jersey, but there's when I grew up in New Jersey, we had a place called Sports World, which is like kind of a micro amusement park, which we'll talk about. There was this really cool arcade called In the Swing, and it was roughly mostly a batting cage place, but they had a beautiful arcade with a miniature interior miniature golf course as well. Oh, by the way, it looks like the Gamers Week podcast stuff is still up. I guess we can get rid of that eventually. But my mom would either drop me off at the arcade and go shopping for the rest of the day, and she would give you like $5, $10, $20, and if you got $20 to spend at the arcade, then you were going to be doing really well. But sometimes I would only get $5, and you would like burn through those quarters in the first half an hour, and my mom probably wouldn't be done with shopping for another hour and a half. So there would be that like lull at the arcade where you're like just looking around, watching people play, and also looking for quarters, like literally going into machines and like checking if there's quarters. Like I remember I would look under machines with my brother. Like it was kind of desperate. Like you were in desperate mode when your parents weren't ready to pick you up and you had no more quarters and you were stuck at the arcade. Now, Andy, whatever you do, don't poop in your pants in the arcade no matter what. I won't. That was a great story, though. Wear your brown pants. You guys remember that, huh? That was in the 80s, though. That was the early 80s. This is a different era. This is Andy older and Andy not pooping in his pants. You know, and right here we're seeing a very early look at a mall arcade in the 90s that I found. It's a really good story. I mean, I can't complain, right? It was a really good story. So here, let me give you a little bit of my just like experience of the arcade. I have a lot of memories with my brother because my brother was only 3 years older than me. So me and him would go to the arcade and, you know, I think for the most part, I would play a lot of co-op beat 'em up games like The Simpsons and X-Men, but I would also play a lot of Street Fighter. And yes, Mr. Arcade, which is an old arcade from North Jersey. But there were also mall arcades. And I wanted to mention that, you know, in the arcade, I mean, in the malls, they usually had an arcade, and it was a dumping ground for your children. You know, it was a place for your parents to go and drop you off and forget about you while you enjoyed yourself in the mall. And a good scene, I think, that really defines this is, let's see, mall arcade, is if you ever saw Terminator 2, there's a scene in the arcade, let me see if I can find it, where this kind of, here it is, this kind of like solidifies like what the culture was like for me. Like, you know, here's John Connor playing, I think it's Afterburner, but you know, it's your typical 90s arcade. They look like they're playing The Simpsons right there. Oh no, that was something else. It was Trot. Whoa, what the hell was that? There's Budnick from Salute Your Shorts. You can't get more 90s than this scene. But this scene's really cool because, as you can see, it's like you could see not only the way people are dressed, but, you know, this is like full on in the early 90s. This is the arcade experience. My town was quite small and had an arcade, but dreamed of, really spoke highly of it. Now, at the time of the 90s arcade, we still had at-home consoles more popular and prevalent, but you would still go to the arcade because the arcade had higher graphics and still had more powerful machines, so you couldn't really get what you get today. Like you have a PS5 at home and, you know, your PS5 might play plenty of good games that you probably could play at home, where back in the 90s, sure, you could play games at home, but it still wasn't the same experience. Biff says, you just threw back then where to go to arcades and games, laundromats, gas stations, pizza joints, 7-Elevens, etc. Yeah, there was like, you know, I always like to say when you go to Vegas, you see a slot machine in almost every store. There was a time in the 90s where you went to an arcade and that's all you ever saw. There was at least one or two arcade machines there for you to kind of like, you know, be a part of. So it's really a culture that's not forgotten, but it's like that's why I wanted to talk. Hey, David, what's up? Welcome. But I really missed it, you know, like I really miss the arcade. But let's get into a couple of things here that is important. You know, one of the big things in the 90s arcade, and I know in America, was the coin line. And what is a coin line? And I'm going to read verbatim from the Urban Dictionary, but then we'll talk a little bit about it. The coin line is a lineup system used for video games that determines who plays next. The coin line can usually be seen on a high-demand game such as music games, fighting games, and they're typically formed using coins or tokens. Although some people may use cards or low-value items such as a penny or a button, most of the time it would be a quarter along the machine. And I'll show you a photo of what I'm talking about. So, and hey, Genzo, thanks so much for gifting David the gift here there. And then thank you for gifting No Fear as well. Appreciate that. The coin line was very important and a really funny, like, kind of part of 90s arcade culture, because usually you'd be waiting in line to play Street Fighter and there might be 3 quarters on the machine, and you put your quarter up and you become the 4th in line, and you stare at your quarter because you know exactly when you're going to go next because your quarter is up. And it was called the coin line, and believe it or not, people obeyed it. It's like, always obey the coin line. I never had an experience with the coin line that didn't work. You know, you literally put your coin up, you were in line. It was kind of cool too, because the 2 people would be playing, and then, you know, you would put your quarter up on their machine just so that you got your spot in line. And I just thought that was one of the most unique cultural things, because if you think about it, we're never going to see that again. Like, who the hell puts quarters on machines anymore like that? I mean, maybe you go to like a barcade or something, you know, that has arcade machines, and you might see it, but I highly doubt you'll see a coin line. And, you know, I was talking to some other people, like some people that went to the arcades in the UK, and they were telling me we never had anything like this. So it's a really interesting cultural reference to arcade gaming. And I don't know if it was just a Northeast thing, or I know for sure in the New Jersey, New York City arcades, they use coin lines. But I don't know if in Canada, you know, like Biff, I know you're here, like in Canada, did they have coin lines? Did they have them in California, which they probably did? No Fear says, oh man, I saw an older kid cheat the coin line at the rink one day, and a crew of little kids kicked his ass. Well, that's funny that you say that, is because you can't screw up the coin line. You must obey the coin line. Like, you really want to screw up the coin line, you're going to get a bunch of kids that are going to kick your ass. And you're right. I highly agree with you that they would probably kick your ass if you mess with the coin line. I never touched those other quarters. I just put my quarter up. When it was my turn, I would go up against whoever the winner was. And that was the cool thing about fighting games, is like the winner stayed. And if you wanted to play the winner, you would have to put in your quarters next. So you really had to obey the coin line. And it looks like Biff, who's from Canada, west coast of Canada, says that there was a coin line as well. It was a system of respect and patience. But it's kind of interesting because you think about it and it's like, wow, that's such a unique reference to arcade culture. And I don't think enough people talk about it. And it really shows you like how a generation back then didn't need instant gratification. Like, today, I could just turn on my PS4 or 5 and go on and play online multiplayer in my fighting games if I want to. There's no coin line. There might be a queue for the online match, but there's no coin line. And it's a physical experience of not experiencing instant gratification, because you would have to wait for your turn, right? And I think that's something that we're completely missing from the gaming industry today, because midnight releases are going away. All that stuff that made you wait. But in a lot of ways, we hate waiting. But when it comes to gaming, there's like a culture behind it. Like going to the store to wait online for the new release or the new Call of Duty coming out on midnight. Or I was a big Madden player. We would even do midnight releases for Madden. I mean, and that was a big deal. And there's all these like little nuances that instant gratification is really, really screwed up in not only arcade culture and just today playing games, and the fact that you barely play games in front of people anymore. You don't do split player James Bond multiplayer. You know, you had to wait for your friends to come over on a Friday night to play Bond. As much as it sucks to wait for that, there's nothing that can replace the experience of that. Because instant gratification has just screwed everything up. No Fear says, really lack of patience these days. Immediate gratification always. Digital download games. Yeah, and that's why I collect retro games, because there's a part of that gives me that feeling of... And you can go to eBay and buy a retro game in an instant gratification format, but I prefer to go to a retro store and buy a game in person. and get that experience. And you might have seen this photo before. This is a really cool photo that's kind of all over the internet, but it defines 90s arcading to the max, because you can imagine right here, there's so many people watching all these fighting games. Each and every one of these arcade machines has a coin line going on. But look how you got the Street Fighter 2 in the back. They're playing over there. You got the Street Fighter 2 here, which is probably Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition or Turbo. Huge line there. You got Mortal Kombat here. Huge line there. And then you got some more scattered Street Fighter in the back, and people are just waiting, either watching. And this is a Twitch stream back then. Your Twitch stream back then at the arcade is when you're a viewer behind the arcade people that are playing and you're watching them. It's pretty much being a Twitch streamer, viewer, because you're at the arcade, but you're watching them play from behind, So now I'm a proud owner of, and hey, what's up, Manny? Welcome to the CafeBTW podcast. Appreciate it. So let's get into just one place I want to talk about. It's called Sports World. And I've talked about it before, but it was located in Paramus, New Jersey. It was my go-to arcade. It was like this huge arcade with little like amusement park rides. It even had like I think it had like a, what's it called? A wheel or whatever and all that stuff. David says, could be worse. He didn't request Barbie's Dream House on the SNES or anything like that. No, he didn't. But games are getting so expensive on the NES that it's like hard to find games that are under $10. Sports World was cool, and it had laser tag, and believe it or not, there's one surviving video from my old arcade, and it's this laser tag intro, and like literally look at this guy's mullet, by the way. That guy is like killing it with the mullet in the 90s. But this was like the actual laser tag room and instructional video, and it's kind of nuts that I found this, because I actually watched this video as a kid. Like, this is like ridiculous. But this is the kind of arcade that had laser tag, miniature golf. They even had bowlingo. If you know what bowlingo is, it's like the small bowling balls. But their arcade was really cool. Like, they had everything from Time Machine, like really obscure arcade machines, to, your typical Street Fighters. And I remember they had like a room filled with like fighting games, and then there was like the beat 'em up games and stuff like that. But this is actually a look at the laser tag at Sports World, and this is actual footage from the arcade I used to go to. Pretty cool to see this. This is like the instructional video, and this laser tag was serious. Like, this was no joke. They had the scoring system. It was really, really, really cool for the 90s. But when you look at laser tag, is it really that much fun, though? Is it really that much fun? Maybe. I always thought it's all BS, So let's get into some of the greatest 90s arcade games to ever grace the arcade. Let's go through a list of them. We're starting off with Killer Instinct, which was definitely a game I played in the arcade. I don't know if you have any connection to Killer Instinct, but Killer Instinct was definitely one that I fully enjoyed. David says, I felt like it was paintball for kids who weren't old enough for that yet. Yeah, you were, but honestly, at times it was like, it was like missing something. It's like, yeah, we're shooting lasers at each other, but yeah, like it was missing like the actual shooting, like the actual paintball. So Killer Instinct is one that I have fond memories of. I don't know if a lot of you have played Windjammers, but Windjammers in the arcade, really fantastic game. And they actually have a sequel to this that's out now called Windjammers 2. Jenza says, pew, pew, pew. And Biff says, I randomly pulled off Caveman Fatality. And, nice. But Windjammers is one that I remember. Let's go up the chain. Let's go to one of the best racing games to ever grace the arcade and the Sega Saturn, believe it or not, is and some of the best music. One of my favorite songs is Let's Go for Daytona USA, but this is like the pinnacle 90s racing arcade game. Laser tag was awesome back then. Really felt like we were going into battle. Yeah, I mean, when we were kids like that back then, I agree. Like, probably for sure, it felt like it was serious. But also, I didn't, love it. Hey, Jan, what's up? Good to see you, man. All right, moving right along. Daytona USA for sure. Let's go to The Simpsons. Beat 'em up, of course. Like, I mean, this is like, how could I talk? If I didn't talk about this game, then I'd be in trouble. This one, I mean, it's the quintessential beat 'em up game with the biggest license in the world, which was Simpsons at the time. This is a time when The Simpsons was still like really like, not to say that people don't watch The Simpsons today, but back then in the 90s, The Simpsons was the shit. And like playing this beat 'em up game, this is a game that you would beat over and over and over again. Like you would beat this game over and over with your friends, but you would still show up to the arcade another week or a month later and you would play it again over and over and over. This is a true 90s beat 'em up. There's nothing more I can say. If you grew up in the 90s arcade and didn't play this, then I don't know what was wrong with you, because this was definitely a game that almost probably 95% of people going to the arcades in the 90s at least played once. I mean, don't quote me on the statistics there, but I must say. All right, moving right along. Another awesome 90s arcade is Smash TV. Smash TV was really fun. It kind of reminds me of The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know if this game was kind of a ripoff of The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and like they stole the whole premise of the movie to make the video game, because that's pretty much what it is. It's like these characters are thrown into like these gauntlets of fighting enemies and trying to survive and get through. And by the way, shout out to The Running Man. Let's pull that up. The Running Man. Is it The Running Man? Yeah, it's Running Man, right? Running Man, Arnold Schwarzenegger. This movie reminds me of Smash TV, or Smash TV reminds me of this movie. And it's just freaking classic Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if you've never seen this movie holds up and was awesome. You know, he gets sent into the battle and he has to survive. Like, this movie was, like, awesome. I never read the book, actually. I should probably read the book. But, dude, this movie was so good. Like, classic. It was 1987, this one, too. So it wasn't 90s, but... oh, man, what a great movie. I didn't know there was a book either. No one told me. Oh, man, I got to rewatch this. Seriously. Does it hold up? I don't know. I definitely got to watch it. What a freaking good movie, huh? But yeah, this movie reminds me of Smash TV because it's kind of the same premise. All right, moving right along. Can't forget about Cruisin' USA, which is also, you know, your other popular racing game in the arcade at the time. No Fear says, Stephen King book to a movie that wasn't terrible, what? Or a 10-part TV miniseries? Biff says that and Stand By Me to King Legends. Stand By Me to King Legends. Stand By Me the movie. Well, Stand By Me is a classic. Yes, there were. There definitely were. There were lots of racing games, but I definitely got to mention Cruising the World there. Gauntlet Legends is one that I think people kind of forget about, but this was really good. I played Gauntlet Legends a ton in the arcade in the 90s. This was a fantastic 90s arcade machine. A really good co-op dungeon crawler in the arcade, and definitely a little bit of an upgrade from the original Gauntlet that we grew up with in the 80s. So I don't know if people have played Gauntlet Legends, but man, really good one here. Spent so many hours on Gauntlet Legends, says Manny. Yeah, Manny, this one, honorable mention because I'm sure people forget to talk about it, so I had to make sure that I brought it up. All right, moving right along in our 90s kind of like best of. How could I talk about the arcades without mentioning one of the greatest beat 'em up games ever freaking made with one of the coolest franchises ever made, X-Men. X-Men Arcade. Just like the Simpsons Arcade, these two went head to head. Like you would either play the Simpsons or you played the X-Men, and you had one or the other, but you had the 6-player X-Men machine, the huge freaking machine with the monitors. And one of the greatest arcade intros in the history of arcade machines, without a doubt. That Magneto right here is iconic. This whole floating over the Sentinels, getting ready to get you excited for the game. It was by far one of the best arcade games ever made, and really is an epitome of the 90s. And and everything that we did in the arcade. This game. And I used to be Colossus, and I liked Colossus, his movie, because he'd go, whoa! He would go, whoa! I can't even do the voice, but, he'd do that thing. Whoa! I know, I suck at the voice. I would always be Colossus, though. And put in chat, who would you be in X-Men Arcade? Who was your go-to in X-Men Arcade? Were you Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm? I'd love to hear in the chat, who did you use in X-Men Arcade? Because you know what? Can't talk about arcades without talking about this damn game. Freaking memories galore. No Fear says Wolverine. Nice. Yeah, and that's like the cool looking Wolverine with the brown, like the old school Wolverine, like the early 80s Wolverine. Manny says Cyclops is my favorite, still my favorite X-Men. I would say that honestly, this has to still be the greatest X-Men game ever made, just in general, even to today. I know that Insomniac is making the Wolverine game in vein of the Spider-Man games, which are great. I think the Spider-Man games on the PlayStation are probably some of the best current superhero game ever made right now. Biff says, I always a main Coda fan myself. More like Street Fighter 2. Yeah, we'll get there. Moving on. Next up, we're going to another racer, which a lot of people forget was in the arcades. Crazy Taxi was actually an arcade stand-up racing game first, before it was the beloved Dreamcast game. And I think it's worth mentioning that this is a very cool arcade game because in the arcade it has the pedals and it has the wheel. So you can really have a really fun time playing Crazy Taxi at the arcade. And it definitely has those 90s vibes going on. And then obviously later on the Dreamcast would release and people would play this at home for hours. So definitely going to mention that. Moving right along, House of the Dead. This is actually the Dreamcast version, but I mean the arcade version. House of the Dead is a great arcade game. House of the Dead 2, can't forget talking about these at all. Really great stuff. Really fantastic game. I'm still looking for it on the Saturn. I actually need it for the Saturn. But House of the Dead, absolutely great stuff here. Moving right along, we're going to do one game that I think is an arcade machine that if you were in the 90s and you didn't play this, then you weren't arcade gaming. Because NBA Jam, regardless if you like sports or if you like basketball, this was a freaking classic. This was everything to most arcade gamers. Like when you think about arcade games, you got Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, you got The Simpsons, you got X-Men, and then you got NBA Jam. Because NBA Jam was super fun. Probably one of the best arcade simulated sport games ever made beyond NFL Blitz, Like this is where the real competition is. And you would also have a coin line on this game because there would be people competing at length at the arcade for hours on end. You cannot talk about arcade games without talking about NBA Jam. And we did do an episode about NBA Jam a while back, a little bit about the history, and that's definitely on my VODs on YouTube, but really great game here. Dave with Founder's Badge. Dave has a Founder's Badge. Oh, wow. Look at that. I love that. Always Bulls Pippin. Oh, my God, NBA Jam. Yes, he's on fire. That's awesome, David. I didn't realize you had the Founder's Badge. You are a special boy. Thank you. So, yeah, we could talk at length about NBA Jam, but we all agree. Time Crisis 2 and Time Crisis in general. What a fun shooter this is. With the pedal, this is freaking awesome. I love this stuff. This game was so good. I also just love Time Crisis machines. They were really large and just really cool, predominant, and just like a really great part of my arcade experience. There's just no doubt about it. So can't talk about arcades without mentioning Time Crisis. Me and my brother would play this for hours. Would lose a lot of quarters, honestly, through this game because I wasn't very good at it, but definitely worth mentioning on our little 90s arcade crawl here. Soul Edge. Not sure a lot of people remember this one, but really fantastic fighting game. Beautiful. Has kind of like the Virtual Fighter look to it. Time Crisis changed the game for shooting arcades with the pedal and the recoil. Yeah, the pedal was super smart because it was like duck and cover, and it really allowed people to, enjoy the shooting style and get the feel of ducking and covering in a game. Really smart idea, kind of adding a pedal to a shooting game where it's not a racing game. So if you think about that, it's pretty cool. Of course, I can't bring up Soul Edge without mentioning Virtual Fighter 2, which is one of my favorite arcade games of all time as well. This is the Sega Saturn version, but we'll just go with it. But Virtual Fighter 2 arcade, I used to play Virtual Fighter 2 a lot in the arcades. Like, this was a freaking... Here's the thing. You had Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, where a lot of it was a lot of involved moves and different combinations, where Virtual Fighter games was a little bit simplified, where it was just really like 3 buttons and you would do combinations of punching and kicking. And what I liked about these games is that they were a little bit easier for someone to play and get good at. It was like the best games are the ones that are simple to use but extremely hard to master. And that's seriously what Virtual Fighter was like. Moving right along, Mortal Kombat 2. How can we talk about arcade games without mentioning Mortal Kombat 2? Mortal Kombat 1, of course, but I was a Raiden main. Manny says, way better to reload instead of shooting off the screen. Manny also says, Virtual Fighter 2 was beautiful to look at in the arcade. It was a beautiful game, and it was different looking. It had that Sega polygon style, and it definitely was pretty cool. I agree. It was really great. But how could we forget about Mortal Kombat? Definitely a staple in the arcade in the 90s. If you went to an arcade and they didn't have Mortal Kombat or Mortal Kombat 2, they had seriously a problem, because usually an arcade would have like 2 to 4 to 6 of these machines at a time, because they were so popular and because just people ate the stuff up. I mean, Mortal Kombat fighting games in the 90s, they just ate it up. So of course we got to mention Mortal Kombat 2. Moving right along, Marvel vs. Capcom. Definitely also a part of this whole thing. All these, that coffee is really sweet. Manny says MK2 was a quarter muncher, but had to keep playing. Yeah, absolutely, man. Unless you're really good at it, you stayed on the machine a longer time. Moving right along, we're going to go to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, which this is not, I apologize, this isn't the arcade version, but all Turtle beat-em-up games have to be mentioned, because Turtle games, just like The Simpsons and the X-Men, I mean, these were, without a doubt, the most loving machines from the 90s, too. I'm surprised I talked about Turtles so late in this episode. I really should have talked about it sooner, but it doesn't matter. We're still talking about it. As we get close to the end of the episode, we're getting there. So I can't talk about arcades without showing Ninja Turtles, because obviously the 90s were big for Ninja Turtles in general, and then the fact that we were playing this in the arcade was also a big deal. Street Fighter. I'm putting up here Street Fighter 3 Alpha, which was classic. There's Akuma. But yeah, I when I'm pulling this up, I'm talking of Street Fighter just as a whole. Street Fighter was also like MK. If you went to an arcade, they had 2 to 4 to 6 machines, maybe even more of these games, because they were awesome. I think if you want to if I had to choose between, did I play Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter more? I think I played Mortal Kombat a little bit more than I played Street Fighter, but I definitely love Street Fighter. And let me hear in chat, did you guys prefer Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat? What was your fighting game of choice? Maybe it was something else like Darkstalkers or Killer Instinct. But Manny says Marvel vs. Capcom is one of the best arcades ever. Turtles was amazing, even better with families and friends. No Fear says, didn't Double Dragon have a fighting mode? Yeah, but Double Dragon, believe it or not, I think was the late 80s. We're focusing on 90s, like hardcore 90s games. We could do a whole episode on 80s as well. Manny says Street Fighter is the arcade of the 90s. They were all great. I mean, yeah, this is just like showing you, just going through these games, like really just showing you, like, man, the 90s arcade was freaking phenomenal. It all blends together, no fear. It really does. But one of my favorite arcade games of all time is definitely, Double Dragon. As a kid, my buddy across the street, who was one of those silver spoon rich kids, he had Double Dragon, and we would play for hours. And I think I've told that story before. All right, moving right along. We're almost at the end here. Tekken. How could I talk about arcade fighting games? We got to talk about Tekken as well, which was a classic, very competitive fighting game. Never really got into it personally. Manny says, love them both, but Street Fighter has the edge slightly. Yeah, and I think Street Fighter 6 got announced. Am I right? Mortal Kombat's on Mortal Kombat 11, and Street Fighter is going to be going on to 6. So it's really interesting to see where their sequels have gone in the last few years. All right, moving right along. Another cool X-Men game was X-Men Children of the Atom, which is a great fighting game too. All these freaking fighting games, man. Look at this. The 90s was killing it. And not only that, one of my favorite fighting games, which I forgot to pull up, is Darkstalkers. And I hope you guys remember Darkstalkers, because this is a freaking fun arcade game. And when this came out in the arcade, I remember my arcade was packed. Like, they only had like one Darkstalkers, and man, people were surrounding that thing when it first came out. Darkstalkers was the shit. It really blew my mind. I love the cartoon fantasy look. It was a little bit of a different take, very Marvel vs. Capcom-y, obviously, but it was freaking cool. And like all the character designs in Darkstalkers, freaking phenomenal. Just a really, really cool game. Really great game. If you've never played it, I highly recommend it. Moving right along. We are going into, what do we got here? Oh, of course, Dance Dance Revolution. How could you not have an arcade without this? I was really bad at it, but man, I mean, I'm not going to forget about, is this Bust a Move or Dance Dance Revolution? I think it's Dance Dance Revolution. Capcom had beautiful graphics. They really did. They also had that style. But yeah, dance game was cool. And here's Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which, by far is one of the greatest Street Fighter arcade games ever made when it came out. It was kind of interesting. Like in the arcade, you would have all these upgrades to like Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, Street Fighter 2 Turbo. This is the Grand Master Challenge here. It was awesome. No Fear says times were different. I don't think parents would let their kids play like this now. We were allowed to watch Ren and Stimpy. The game we watched everyone else play in the early 2000s. Yeah, man, can someone like take me back in time right now? Like, I really wish we can just like time travel right now. To close out, another arcade game we can't talk about is Soul Calibur. A lot of people remember Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast, but do you remember it in the arcade? Soul Calibur is a freaking phenomenal fighting game, very much in the vein of Virtua Fighter, but a lot better, in my opinion. Hyper Fighting Rainbow Championship Edition, so many great Street Fighters, absolutely. But Soul Calibur, really, really cool game, especially when it came out on the Dreamcast. Really freaking cool. So that is like kind of a glimpse, a little bit of just like a reminder of like, hey, here are some games that we grew up on. Let's look at them. Now, the cultural importance of the video game arcade. What does the future look like for the arcade? Before the pandemic, we were starting to get this kind of explosion of the barcade. In Los Angeles, a couple of honorable mentions of those was 82, which is downtown LA, which is, slash a bar, a place to get great cocktails and also play a lot of retro games and pinball. There was this one place that hasn't reopened called Spud and Mash, where it was Pan-Asian fusion food with some really great collection of arcade machines and pinball, a little bit of pinball. And then the pandemic happened. And the idea of touching things became a big no-no. And I think a lot of those arcades went under. And now we're coming out of it, and people are starting to go back to those types of places. But I think that the pandemic put a real kind of dagger into kind of like the culture of getting the arcade to come back. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope that we see more of the arcade again and those retro kind of like bars and restaurants, because that's where we're going to see them again. There are arcades, though, still. I know in Los Angeles there's a lot of arcades still that you can go to, and probably around the country as well. But it's interesting to note, in this world of a pandemic and the idea of touching a lot of things that people are touching, the arcade is like that. It's not a clean place. If you think about the arcade as kids, we were probably like dirty, disgusting children with our disgusting hands touching arcade machines left and right. And maybe some of us were sick at times, and our parents would still take us to the arcade. I can't imagine the germs that we took from each other, because nothing spreads germs more than touching, Yeah, the carpet was always pretty nasty, right? Unless they took really good care of it. Manny says, arcades made a huge comeback, but worried that Arcade 1-Up is very slowly killing their... You know what? Can I just say something? As much as Arcade 1-Up is really cool, I'm not really into it. I feel like it's like experiencing the arcade machines in a cheaper form. And I'm sorry, I like what they're doing, but I'm just not into it. I just can't get behind it. If I have the money one day and I can build my man cave, I'm going to buy an original arcade machine that I can kind of like fix and keep alive, as opposed to getting an Arcade 1-Up. I'm just not a fan. I'm sorry. I think it's cool. I think what they're doing is fun. But yeah, you're right. In the old arcades, people were smoking cigarettes. It was dirty. In the 80s, there were gangs that would hang out at arcades, and people would be, it wasn't really a safe place to go. But in the 90s was a little different, though. It wasn't like it was unsafe to go to the arcade as much. But like, what do you guys think the future is going to hold for arcades? I mean, I know I heard like Arcade 1-Up and stuff, but it's really interesting to note that where are we going with this? Like, is it just more of the Arcade 1-Up stuff? Will we get that? Will we ever have an arcade boom again? Or is everything just console related and back in the home? That's the problem. Thank you, Manny. I'm glad that someone that's a big arcade person agrees with me as well. That being said, as a little fun thing I did on Twitter, it doesn't have a lot to do with arcade, but I did ask a question. I wanted to, as we close out this episode, and by the way, thank you so much for sitting with me on this 90s culture look at the 90s culture of arcading, and really wanted to have a simple episode. No guests this week. We do have a guest coming at the end of the month. More on that soon. And we have a couple of guests coming in May, so I'm excited about that. But on Twitter, I did ask everyone, if you could only play one video game for the rest of your life, what game would you choose? And I got a few people here said Final Fantasy would be a good choice for this. It's a constant beast and so many things to do. Something endless, no matter how big a game like Witcher 3 or Fallout 4 may, you'll still pretty much have a lot to do. But he says Tetris or SimCity would be a good one. Anything Elder Scrolls, Dark Savior, Ocarina of Time, Sonic, Fallout. We got GTA San Andreas. We got Deus Ex. We got Doom 1, Bloodborne, BioShock, Halo. So yeah, in chat, tell me, what game would you choose? If you could only choose one game to play for the rest of your life, what game would that be? One person said Pokemon Stadium. We got Castlevania here. The Last of Us. You got any Mario series, Pokemon Generation 1, Gauntlet, League of Legends, probably that one makes sense. Witcher 3, Castlevania, Kingdom Hearts 2, Control, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, and we got a Tecmo Super Bowl here too. So yeah, everyone. And remember, just before we go, on Twitter, if you go to my Twitter profile and you check the pinned tweet, we have the retro gaming community. We're closing out on 1,000 members. If you're looking for a safe place to share your love of retro gaming, hit that link. Come on and join our community. At 1,000 members, we're doing a giveaway for a physical NES game at 1,000 members. And this is a place where you can share your pickups. If you don't want to put something on the timeline in your main feed, come in the retro gaming community and join it. I'm going to put in the invite right here in chat if you're interested. Please check it out. Join the retro gaming community that we're building. There's a lot of cool people in there. And ever since the retro gaming community kind of launched on Twitter, it's been really cool to see all the people. We have over 974 members right now. And I'm very, very humbled to see our community grow that fast. But if you're interested, hit my Twitter, and the pinned tweet will have the link if you don't see the link here. I want to say thanks to everyone that stopped by today. I thought it was a really fun episode, a little single solo one today, no guests. We had the Gamers Week podcast 2 weeks ago. That was a really fun episode. As always, I love seeing everyone in chat. I love hanging out with you and talking about retro gaming. We got lots more episodes to come, a lot to do. And I want to say big thanks to the VOD people. Everyone, we are on YouTube now. If you check out, there is the CafeBTW YouTube. So please, if you missed the live show, we now, and I'll throw it in chat, we now have our YouTube, and all the VODs for each episode go up immediately about a half an hour after the live. So if you missed the live show, we have the VOD available for you. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube, definitely do that. I also put a lot of cool videos up there as well, all retro gaming related. David Alexander says, oh snap, I just realized you sent me a 3-month sub. Thanks again. Manny says, had a great time. Great show. Thanks, Manny, for coming by. It means a lot. More to come. That being said, let me see if there's anyone we could raid today that's worth raiding. I haven't been raiding much people, but let's raid my good friend, the Nino Poke Bros, because they are truly awesome people. One of my favorite streamers. If you like Pokemon streams, the Nino Poke Bros are your ones to support. So again, what I like to say is, before I go, one main thing I'd like to say to everybody, okay? We only get one shot at this, so be nice to people. I'm Andy. Until next time, we'll see you next Saturday on CafeBTW, a morning gaming podcast. Till next time, I'll see you then.